Welcome, everyone in the audience tuning in to another iteration of ISDP's Taiwan Lecture Series. My name is August Borjesson, and I am the acting head of ISDP's Stockholm Taiwan Center. Today, we have a special lecture, as it is our great privilege to once again be joined by Dr. Zsuzsa Ferenczy, who will give a talk about her latest book, Partners in Peace: Why Taiwan and Europe Matter to Each Other. Brussels has secured a place for Taiwan as a partner in its political discourse, and Taiwan, on its part, has sought to better position itself towards Europe by engaging its member states, in particular those in Central Eastern Europe, but also the EU as a bloc. Taiwan's geo-strategic relevance is likely to grow in the Indo-Pacific, a region of great significance to the EU's own interests. So Dr. Ferenczi's book addresses some fundamental questions. With the EU seeing Taiwan as a partner on its own merit, not just from a China lens, how can the two sides consolidate this new normal? In other words, what is next? How can Europe and Taiwan expand cooperation in a way that both increases the EU's role in shaping Taiwan's future and empowers Taiwan to exercise agency? After Dr. Ferenczi's presentation today, the audience tuning in will have an opportunity to post their questions in the Q&A function. And during the presentation, we will try to cover as many of them as we can after the presentation. So, our presenter today, Dr. Zsuzsa Ferenczy, is an affiliated scholar at the Department of Political Science of Vrije Universiteit Brussels and an associated research fellow at the Institute for Security and Development Policy. She is also an assistant professor of the National Donghua University in Hualien, Taiwan, and between 2008 and 2020, she worked as a political advisor in the European Parliament. Today, to present her latest book, Partners in Peace: Why Europe and Taiwan Matter to Each Other, ISDP's Stockholm Taiwan Center gives a warm welcome to Dr. Zsuzsa Ferenczy. And Dr. Ferenczy, I now give the floor to you.
Thank you, August. Thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone joining us today. It is really nice to be back, and also it is a great honor to be able to present my book, my latest research on EU-Taiwan relations. So I did prepare a few slides, I think, that will facilitate the discussion, and then I'm also happy to engage with the audience. So I invite you to not just come with questions, but perhaps challenge me on any points as you see fit. So I will share my screen. And I think this should be on right now, right? So with that, let me just begin. I'll speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll give the floor back to you, August. So thanks again. So as you see here on the cover page, and I open my presentation with that, it is the cover of my book. And let me just say a few words about the title, because I think whenever we see a book, the title is quite important and can be very revealing. And so I thought it would be very appropriate to talk about Europe's or the EU's relationship with Taiwan as a partnership. I think this is the best way that I can describe this relationship, this cooperation. And of course, I think we are used to having a conversation about Taiwan, not so much with Taiwan. And that's another thing that I thought would be kind of bridged over with the subtitle that I chose, which is that Europe and Taiwan matter to each other, not just that Taiwan matters for the rest of the world. So my research is, I think I would go back to the past 5 years in particular, because that's when I started to live in Taiwan. And I've spent time in Taiwan in about 10 years ago for my doctoral research. But in 2020, I decided to spend some more time here and kind of get a sense of how things are seen from within. Because as I said, we always look at Taiwan from the outside. I mean, that's natural for all of the people living outside of Taiwan. But I think if we really want to get to understand what's happening and how perceptions have shifted or are shifting, I think it's important to spend time on the ground. So the questions that I've dealt with or kind of constantly kept thinking about as I was writing this book in the past 2 years, I would say, these are questions that I get often when I'm in Europe. And so why should Europeans care about Taiwan, right? Or why does a complex cross-strait relationship matter for Europe? Or the third question would be, what can Europe do to contribute to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region? And finally, does the EU have the political will to act as a geopolitical power in its relations with Taiwan? So if you look at these four questions, they all come from a European perspective, right? Which is less what I try to reflect through the title, that we are in a partnership where both sides are engaged. So we should stop looking at Taiwan only from the European perspective, but this conversation should be one that is mutually shaped. And therefore, as I explained already, the right question to ask, I would say, that why do Europe and Taiwan matter to each other? But if we go beyond this bilateral relationship, I think there's a lot more questions. And obviously, the book does not address all questions that are possible, nor do I have the time for much more than covering EU-Taiwan relations. But it is very important to look at the context of where EU-Taiwan relations sit. And from Europe's perspective, but I would say equally from Taiwan's perspective, both sides are adjusting to a new geopolitical, geoeconomic reality. And this is something that is, again, the bigger question, the open question. How are we adjusting? Are we able to adjust together? Is that useful, helpful, possible? Also, the question for Europe is how to deal with Russia. And I mean, obviously, that is a question much more relevant following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the full-scale invasion. Also, how do we deal with China going forward? But of course, in the past, I guess, since January, the question is also, how do we deal with transatlantic relations? And that is a question that has equally been on everyone's mind, I suppose. But these are all relevant to understanding the EU's approach vis-a-vis Taiwan. So how do we position ourselves? But again, how does Taiwan position itself vis-a-vis Europe? So my main argument here would be, and perhaps it's useful if we start at the bottom. So the last bullet point there is highlighted in red, is what I would say is that the EU started seeing Taiwan on its own merit, not through the China lens only. So this is something that I unpack in the book, and I will explain how and what makes me say this with confidence. And also that going forward, obviously, we have a momentum, but political courage, political will matters a lot. So if we take a bigger look at things, then to support this argument, I would say that it is not the US-China rivalry that will shape the future of the international order, but the response to the rivalry. And of course, by that, I mean everyone else's response, but in this particular case, the EU's response and Taiwan's response to that, the positioning of these two partners. And as far as the EU is concerned, we are rethinking our global role. And I would say that this has been fundamentally driven by an assertive China that has been an an enabler of an aggressive Russia. So this is quite central to how the EU sees itself globally and where the challenges lie. As I said, of course, we have seen that there's been a series of new tools. I would mention here the Indo-Pacific strategy, the CHIPS Act, or the Global Gateway, and many more trade defensive tools. And this is a reflection that a new thinking has taken place or shape in the EU, which means that there has been more awareness of Taiwan's importance. There's been more clarity in the language that we use concerning Taiwan, and there's also been more pushback against attempts to disturb this thinking process, and also to hinder, to undermine European thinking on the new direction. This might sound quite positive, but of course we need to stay realistic. So I will try to stay as nuanced as possible, but I think it's good to have a clear starting point also for the audience to engage with, that this is kind of the background and the premise, and this is what I will unpack. So I will situate EU-Taiwan relations in the larger context. As I said, that is crucial to understanding the bilateral relationship within the context of the Indo-Pacific, where ASEAN is a very important actor and factor, of course, as much as the China factor, but we can no longer, and I think we should no longer just speak about the China factor, but the Russia factor for the EU's positioning in the future. Perceptions and self-perceptions are very important in understanding, and that's something I said at the beginning, how crucial I think it is to spend time for Europeans inside Taiwan. And I don't mean like a month or two, but I think if we have the luxury and the opportunity to really engage from within, because otherwise we're not able to really understand the internal dynamics. And something I said that I'm happy to speak with confidence about is this Taiwan narrative that has emerged. There are limitations and boundaries to that, and I will explain what I mean by that. And of course, an element that links Europe and Taiwan, I think, is the effort to build up more resilience, and that's something that I will finish my presentation on. So just a few words about Taiwan for the audience here, that Taiwan is the world's 16th largest economy, and it produces over 90% of most advanced chips. And a word here, I think everyone is interested in semiconductors, and TSMC is on our minds when we think about Taiwan. But here I would add something that I don't often hear, is that we need to remember that producing these chips is really the product of international cooperation. So the success of Taiwan's chip industry relies on US, European, Japanese collaboration. And this is not at all to undermine the capacity we have, or Taiwan has built up, but this is just to give it the right significance, how important it is to maintain that collaboration, because no single company can go it alone, and no single country can own an entire semiconductor supply chain. And I think that's an important point here. Now, speaking of the Taiwan Strait, we also know that it is a key shipping route. 88% of the world's largest ships pass through it, and it is a corridor of international waters and airspace within which all states and their vessels are to enjoy freedom of navigation and overflight. So this means that the Taiwan Strait is international waters. It does not belong to the PRC, and this is the position that the EU has taken, meaning that the EU does not take a position on Taiwan's international status. And this is something I will come back to later on. Just a refresher here that Taiwan sits in the first island chain, which goes from Japan through Taiwan and the Philippines. And this is something that clearly is an obstruction for China to access the Pacific. And this is something that also reflects the importance of Taiwan to the PRC. And this is perhaps also not new information for most of us, hopefully in the room, in the virtual room here, but I think it's also good to just have a quick 1 minute on the situation in terms of what the median line is, and how the Chinese or the PRC has used gray zone pressure against Taiwan to intimidate Taiwan and to test the response by crossing this median line increasingly and setting a new normal. Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which is an international airspace that countries can arbitrarily monitor. Also, it's a space that does not have international legal framework. So to establish this does not have a legal framework. Nonetheless, Taiwan has been monitoring how China has been violating this space over the past months and years. And the aim has been and remains to normalize PRC military presence closer to Taiwan as an assertion of sovereignty. So speaking of the Taiwan Strait and bringing Europe back into the picture, while the German warship transit, we might remember, happened in 2024, the last transit, which was the first in more than 20 years. And this happened also 1 month after the TSMC held its groundbreaking ceremony in Dresden. So I actually perhaps jump to that slide because here you see a little bit of background to the creation and the launch of ESMC, which is the European Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is 70% TSMC, and the other 30% is 3 European partners, a Dutch and 2 German tech companies. And so this was possible because the EU approved a German state aid of 5 billion euros to build this chip facility. And this should be seen in the EU's effort to increase or rather to reduce its supply vulnerabilities when it comes to semiconductors. So I'm using this example here, in a way linking the German warship transiting and Germany playing a more significant role, perhaps signaling. Again, we don't have too many similar experiences or examples that I could share here, because the situation on the reality is that member states have different capacities and different ambitions in terms of playing a larger role in the Indo-Pacific. Nonetheless, this is an example. Also, an Italian, a Dutch, also UK transits have taken place. And this is, in my reading, in a way, an attempt to contribute to maintaining peace and stability in the region. Of course, we also have, mid-February, we saw a Canadian transit, which was the first in 2025 and the 6th of such transit from Canada since the launch of its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So this is how the situation is really emerging in Taiwan Strait and how Europe can engage in this. But if we again take a step out of what of the EU-Taiwan context, and we look at how the EU's relationship with China has shifted in the past years as well, I would say that there's one phrase that kind of encapsulates the mood in Europe, and this is to say that China has changed, therefore we have to change. So you might remember that in 2023, the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she traveled to Beijing, and right before that, she had a very important speech in which she talked about the de-risking, and she also was quite strong-worded in her description of China. She said that China has turned the page on the era of reform and opening, and is moving into a new era of security and control. She also said, as I said, that the world has changed, China has changed. And she added, as I said earlier, the China-Russia factor. She also said that how China continues to interact with Putin's war will be a determining factor for EU-China relations going forward. Now, in contrast with that, I should say that if we look at how the language on Taiwan has shifted in the European narrative, I'm using a resolution from 2021 from the European Parliament in which I picked just one sentence in which it says that Taiwan's location, its critical role in global high-tech supply chains, and its democratic way of life makes it strategically important for European democracies. And I would say that this quote also helps to indicate how the EU's approach vis-à-vis Taiwan has started to shift in this direction. This was 2021, so already pretty much 3-4 years ago. And I will then move on to kind of describe where we are today. But this is the past 5 years. And just another word from the speech that Ursula von der Leyen had in 23, she also said that China has taken a more assertive stance in its own neighborhood. She mentions also that we underscore the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and any weakening of regional stability in Asia affects our own interest in the region. This is also quite important for the EU's position on Taiwan and in the Indo-Pacific, understanding that this is something that the EU's, it's in a way, its own responsibility to look after its own interest, and understanding this dimension has really raised a sense of urgency in Europe to be more strategic about Taiwan. Now, I have a slide here, I think that's quite useful to make a point here that we have to be clear that there are boundaries to our relationship with Taiwan, that we have a one China policy, according to which the EU recognizes the PRC as the sole legal government of China and cooperates with Taiwan without diplomatic recognition. Now, in contrast, Beijing has its own one China principle, according to which Taiwan is an inalienable part of China and the government of the PRC is the sole legal government representing the whole of China. So what difference the past 5 years have made is that in my research, what I notice is that there's more awareness that we need to be more clear that we have a one China policy that is not the one China principle, and stating this in such clear terms is not something you would find in any EU documents 5-6 years ago, but you do find it in recent years. And for me, because narrative shaping is so important, this is how I would assess the current state of affairs in the EU's approach to China and again, and in Taiwan. So, and again, the EU does not take a position on Taiwan's international status. I've said that before, but there's no harm in repeating it because I think it's crucial. And basically the bottom part of this slide, I think also contains all the important elements when it comes to how we see Taiwan in the EU, that cooperation with Taiwan and supporting its meaningful participation as an economy in international organizations that doesn't require statehood does not violate the EU's relations with China. So this is something that I see Europeans being more willing to say and to use in response to attempts from the PRC to undermine our position and our relations with Taiwan. And so, of course, things are not as, say, consistent as perhaps everything that I've said so far might suggest, because China is an important trade partner for Europe. And so you do see at the same time a bit of a back and forth between among Europeans on how we go forward with China. So at the last Davos meeting in February, I think it was early this year, Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, she also said that we should strive for mutual benefits in our conversations with China, and we must engage constructively with China to find solutions. So this is to say that I do not think that this undermines what she had said earlier, but it does reflect that we are in a difficult situation going forward with China, because we have to be more aware of the risks, but we have to engage China constructively or find out what the constructive way is, again, because we have interests to protect, and this is the way going forward. Now, I'm just using here also a quote from the EU's newly elected or appointed, rather, High Representative Kaja Kallas, who said back in 2022 that China is an important actor, but given the scale of the conflict with Russia, we can't make China our adversary. We can't afford that. So this also shows that the EU needs to rethink very seriously how it goes forward with China. And this is something that other European leaders have also said, that rebalancing relations with China are going to be shaped by the situation that Europe finds itself in, with conventional war back at the heart of Europe, and the violation of international law by Russia. So Europe remains concerned. I use that as a quote because when you read European statements or resolutions, they often start with the sentence that Europe is alarmed or concerned. And then the question is, okay, so what is Europe going to do about it? Because being concerned is not enough. We've had a couple of wake-up calls, and I'm afraid we will have more wake-up calls because it takes time for the EU to be able to really fully converge. And perhaps that's not even realistic because we are 27 sovereign states. So speaking with one voice, I don't think that is the end game here because I don't see that possible, but I do see the need to coordinate, and that only can happen if every single member state is on the same page. Of course, this is often made more difficult because there is a lot of questioning about the global order. It was, and it is often European leaders themselves who've said that multilateralism is dead. We've seen minilateralism take shape as a coping mechanism to tackle global challenges. We've also seen multipolarity used often by countries such as China, Russia, two good friends when it comes to undermining the existing global order to their benefit. And so I think the bottom line here is that countries want options, and the China factor has been important seen from Europe because of a long list of grievances that the Europeans have had. And also the reality is that we are over-reliant on China for 98% of rare earth elements and also for 60% of critical raw materials. And this is very crucial for our green and digital transition, for chips. And so this is the kind of just a quick look at the challenges and the complexity of how the EU needs to deal with its concerns in a much more strategic way. If we look at the Indo-Pacific and where Taiwan lies at the heart of the Indo-Pacific, perceptions are very different from country to country. We often speak about the global South as some may say developing countries, emerging economies, and we've seen the reaction to the US-China rivalry from the global South also in a way to assert themselves more actively. India, in this sense, has really positioned itself as the voice of the global South. The Indo-Pacific for India is important. We've seen India-Taiwan relations also gradually, slowly intensify in response to the global dynamics. Of course, Beijing and Washington are in a geo-strategic rivalry. So I think they both see each other through the lens of this rivalry, which clearly makes things a lot more difficult. And the view in Taipei has been that the PRC poses an existential threat. Everyone in the region matters for Taiwan's future, ASEAN in particular, through, as we've seen, the new southbound policy as a tool for Taiwan to really establish closer links with these countries. And then if we take this conversation to Brussels, then I already started talking about the Taiwan narrative, but I think that's just one side of the complexity, because then we have to look at what is the view in Paris, Berlin, Prague, Budapest, or all the other member states. Because again, I keep going back and forth between the EU as such, as the institutions and member states, because that fragmentation is really what matters in shaping the future of EU-Taiwan relations. And why ASEAN matters is I'm using figures here, and I do have a chapter in the book about Taiwan and ASEAN and EU as a win-win-win kind of situation, where I think all three actors would have nothing but much to win from closer cooperation through trade and politically speaking. But again, the EU is fragmented, ASEAN is diverse, and Taiwan is diplomatically isolated. And I here just mentioned just the very little one dimension of the complexity, but the reality is already that 4 of the top 10 countries attracting Taiwanese FDI are in the region in ASEAN, and ASEAN is Taiwan's second largest export market after China. Now, if we look at the Indo-Pacific and dynamics in cross-strait relations and how China has really increased its pressure, and this is likely going to further increase in the coming months and years, because Taiwan remains a red line, a core national issue for China. What we've seen in the past year and months is an escalation in the legal warfare against Taiwan. So what is interesting, and there's a lot to discuss here, but we don't have the time today, but therefore I only will speak about the activities of the Chinese Coast Guard and their so-called law enforcement patrols around Jinmen, one of Taiwan's outlying islands, which has been described as routine harassment by the Taiwanese side, whereas Beijing describes these as law enforcement patrols. And I looked at some figures in 2024. There were 64 Chinese Coast Guard vessels that entered into Jinmen's waters. That means about 4 per month, and each entry lasted about 2 hours or so. So that just gives you an idea of how routine these harassments, and I think I'll use that term here, have become. And the aim has been to erode Taiwan's control of waters around its outlying islands and to assert PRC's rights to enforce its laws there. And then the legal foundation for these CCG moves is there. So in 2018, the Coast Guard was moved from under civilian state oceanic administration to under the People's Armed Police that reports directly to China's Central Military Commission. And then the 2021 China Coast Guard law allows the CCG to engage in law enforcement operations and conduct eviction of foreign military vessels. So this is part and only one part of the pressure that the PRC has placed on and continues to use against Taiwan to intimidate, to test, to rehearse. And what happens around the Jinmen Island is referred to in the Chinese or PRC media as the Jinmen model of law enforcement, which can, and quote, can also be applied to Matsu and Penghu Islands, even the entire Taiwan Strait. So I think I don't sit in Brussels and I spend more time in Taipei, but to my knowledge and understanding, these conversations also have picked up in Europe. But I think we still need to be a bit more strategic about how do we respond to this situation escalating, given that our interests lie in the region. And you remember the Joint SWORD 2024A military drills from May 2024. Then there was a B follow-up military exercise, and there was a C one. So these are important because there is a military police coordination between the PLA and the Chinese Coast Guard to surround Taiwan and Taiwan-controlled outlying islands. So practically, it gives the PRC experience in how it would deal with a situation seeking to take Taiwan in whichever way it seeks to do. So the EU has an Indo-Pacific strategy. I mention that it is one of our tools that I think reflect the fact that we are more aware of the situation. Again, this doesn't sound very serious. I do realize that being aware is clearly not enough. But it is the start of it, or it was back in 21. The question is what do we do about it now, and how do we implement this strategy? There are different priorities, including digital governance, green transition, so everything pretty much that I've covered so far. But then there is this tendency from certain member states, some more than others, to make sure that they avoid that Beijing perceives this strategy as being anti-China, because China has been very successfully projecting or portraying rather European countries pushing back against interference as being simply anti-China. And that's something we have to be very mindful of. Taiwan, in response to everything happening, has projected itself as a force for good. And this was very clearly seen in the 8 years of the rule of the presidency of Tsai Ing-wen between 2016 and 24. And when she left in her last New Year address in 24, she said, if someone were to ask me what my legacy for Taiwan is, I would say that I am leaving behind a Taiwan of the world. And I think this is very important to suggest how Taiwan sees itself. And this is also quite interesting, that Taiwan is the world's Taiwan. That's how I would say the diplomatic engagement has been coming out of Taipei, whereas Beijing's language on that has been that Taiwan belongs to the PRC, period. So there's nothing to discuss. I've seen, and I think what we see and what we witness under the new president in power since 24 is, so it's been a year now, he took office in May 24, that there's continuity from Tsai Ing-wen to Lai Ching-te, the new president, and that Taiwan wants to be a force for good in the international community. And so just a few words here before I wrap up, that the EU's, from when it comes to the EU, and I write at length about this in the book, is Europe's parliamentary diplomacy. And I think this has been something very important as an instrument, as a way to engage Taiwan and to elevate Taiwan on the European agenda through our resolutions, delegation visits, EP, Common and Foreign and Security Policy reports. And if we do a search or we research these documents that have been adopted, none of them are legally binding, because the European Parliament does not have that authority or competence in foreign policy, EU foreign policy, because that is in the hands of member states. However, the language has changed, where we have the first ever standalone report on Taiwan in 2021, in which members of the European Parliament called on the EU to intensify political relations to pursue a comprehensive and enhanced partnership under the guidance of the EU's One China policy. Again, this is nothing but clear language to me. This is not being cautious vis-a-vis Beijing. We have to say it as, for now, this is what it is. We have a One China policy. We're bound by that, but that does not stop us from enhancing partnership with Taiwan. So this has really strengthened in the years that followed. In 21, Taiwan has been mentioned in these annual reports many times. And the core of this language, this narrative on Taiwan, is that Taiwan is a like-minded partner, a key EU partner and democratic ally in the Indo-Pacific, with whom we can cooperate, and we should, and we have actually already started to cooperate in countering disinformation and foreign interference. That's something that has been very much on the agenda. And this is actually, I'm using this slide here. This was a visit in 2021 in November, when a delegation from the European Parliament visited Taiwan, a cross-party delegation led by the French MEP, Raphael Glucksmann. And this is a quote that we often, or I at least often come back to, that he said that we came here to learn from you. And again, this is a very good indication of how we now see Taiwan as a partner, someone that we can learn from, not only as an object and a victim of Chinese pressure. So this is a very important dimension of this relationship. Again, I do cover this at length in the book, so I invite you to read more about that if you get a chance. And of course, all of this in terms of how much Taiwan is a partner is being shaped by the Russia-China factor and the willingness to connect the dots is there both in Europe and in Taiwan. So Taiwan's current vice president, Xiaobi-Kim, she said at one point in 2023 that Ukraine's survival is Taiwan's survival, Ukraine's success is Taiwan's success, and our futures are closely linked. And this is something that I've also witnessed as I am based on the ground immediately after the invasion of Ukraine. There's been a lot of protests in Taipei, in Taiwan, and I myself joined some of these. And I think this is another indication that Taiwan does want to participate as a partner in Europe's challenges and in finding solutions to those challenges. So finally, and I will wrap up here, is that there are definitely lots of stories to tell on both sides. And I think both sides have lessons to learn from each other. Taiwan definitely has to learn to better navigate the EU's multi-layered governance. This is something that is not going to go anywhere. This is part of what the EU is as an international organization, and it might be difficult to engage with that, but this is the only way. And this will also help consolidate Taiwan's internationalization. I think the EU has played a role in that. Again, this was very much driven by Taiwan's response to the pandemic. I haven't really spoken about that in today's discussion, but clearly that was a very significant factor in shifting Taiwan's self-perception and also the EU's perception of China and COVID and China's management of COVID or mismanagement and Taiwan's exemplary management of the pandemic. So when it comes to the EU, we also need to better understand Taiwan's complex relationship with China. This is something I think that we still need to work on because Taiwan as an island is very polarized. There's very many, there's freedom of speech. It's a solid, robust democracy, which means that people debate and have different feelings about China. They have different feelings about what it means to be Taiwanese, politically speaking or culturally speaking. So I think because of the distance, we might not be natural partners, but I think we are partners of choice. And so this requires investment from both sides. I would say also that Ukraine is currently in an existential fight with Russia, while Taiwan faces an existential threat from China. This is very much the reality that Europe will have to play a significant role in also going forward. And that will mean that political courage matters. And I think this is something that will be really indispensable to seeing the Indo-Pacific strategy implemented, to seeing the Taiwan narrative, as positive as it might sound, consolidated. And the test is really how we will use this. So why I do understand that perhaps the picture here, as I painted it, or perhaps it's just in my mind, perhaps it's more positive than it is in the reality, but I do trust that the awareness on both sides has increased. And I think that this is what we can and should work with going forward. So I think I'll stop here so that we have more time for conversation with the audience, and I'll give the floor back to you here, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsa, for a terrific presentation. Very interesting and where to start. There's so much to discuss, and I'm happy to lead off this discussion with a couple of questions on my own, and then we'll take some from the audience. But I think so. You mentioned that you're not opposed to a little bit of a challenge on your views. So I feel a little bit inclined to ask a question in that regard. I think at this point, many have heard about the parallel being drawn between Ukraine and Taiwan, between Russia and China. And that's something that you came back to multiple times in your presentation. And I think if you ask Beijing, for example, they would say there's no parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan. So I guess I'm probing you a little bit to the sort of the opposite view. What do you think? Is there a clear parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan, and is China and Russia the same, so to speak?
Yes, thanks for the challenging question. And I mean, this is the only way we grow, right? If we get questions that are not perhaps the easiest. So let me just think about that and share some of the thoughts I have on Russia, China, and Ukraine, Taiwan. So I would say, and I perhaps start with this anecdote. I was in a academic conference in Vietnam recently, and I made a presentation about the similar, more like a geopolitical Europe in the future. And of course, speaking of geopolitics and Europe and the future, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan is part of that conversation. So I used a slide with Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. Remember that Kishida, former Prime Minister Kishida, made that statement a couple of years ago, and there was a pushback in the room from Chinese presence who said that this is not something that anyone believes to be the case. This is only Washington. And if Europeans say that, it's because we listen to Washington in that sense, as if we didn't have any interest of our own. I mean, Ukraine is Europe and Russia is in our neighborhood. So I would say that we can and we should link these developments, because whatever happens in the Atlantic affects the rest of the world and in the Indo-Pacific, especially when we're dealing with a country such as Russia and Ukraine. We've seen that the impact of that in the entire developing world. And also if something happens in the Taiwan Strait, knowing that close to 90% of the world trade in terms of greatest trade cargo ships pass through the Taiwan Strait, clearly there will be implications for us. Now, Russia and China are not the same. Ukraine and Taiwan are not the same. But what is similar is that Ukraine has been in an existential, say, or is involved, as I said earlier, in an existential fight with Russia, because Russia's aim is to completely undermine and destroy what it means to be Ukrainian. I mean, there is no Ukraine for Russia. And I think when seen from Taiwan, the Taiwanese people very much identified with this, the threat of being a smaller neighbor facing an existential threat. And I think this is also something that brought the Taiwanese closer to the conversations in Europe about EU-Russia relations, and it also helped understand maybe the complexity of EU-Russia relations at the same time of our over-reliance on Russian energy, and what that meant and how we had to adapt to that immediately after the invasion, and how we actually managed to do that in the past 4 years, and how cross-strait relations are actually the core of cross-strait relations is bilateral trade between China and Taiwan. And Taiwan is very vulnerable to China because of this reliance. Of course, there's been an effort to reduce that, but I think there are many lessons clearly for everyone, and Beijing, I'm sure, has or perhaps is learning its own lessons. But what the attack on Ukraine has done is to really bring actually the Europeans closer to its partners in the Indo-Pacific, because both sides do understand that whatever happens in one region affects the other. We need in Europe to have a different strategy for China and a different strategy for Russia, because our relations with the two countries are different. But we have to be very mindful and to understand that Russia and China have displayed perhaps definitely no limits friendship, but the language that China has used following the aggression has been really in line with the Kremlin's language, and the speaking points are shared. So that tells us a lot about how useful it's been for Beijing to support Russia in its invasion of Ukraine and in undermining Europe. At the same time, and last point on this, for Russia, clearly Russia does not want to be over-reliant on China either. So that will also be an important dynamic to see how their relationship will evolve. But certainly they are on the same page when it comes to multipolarity, when it comes to undermining liberal Western democracy and putting forward an alternative governance model. And I would say in this, it is China that's leading and Russia remains a junior partner. So I'll stop here so we have more time for questions.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsa, and thank you for accepting a little challenge. Thank you very much. So I think I'm also curious to know your perspective on Trump. You mentioned in your answer just now Washington and the transatlantic cooperation. What do you? I realized that this book has been written over 2 years, so it was before Trump came to power again. What do you think this new Trump presidency means in this regard for Taiwan and the EU?
Yes, so the book was finalized before Trump's return to the White House, and clearly we thought we were prepared for Trump 2.0, but I don't think anyone was prepared to see the kind of destruction that we're seeing coming out of the White House in terms of undermining the transatlantic relationship. I mean, we've seen already several examples where Washington has made it clear, or the Trump administration, that even with its allies, transactional approach will be the way. And I think this is pushing Europe to a new place. Well, it should have pushed us earlier. We shouldn't have over-relied on perhaps for our security on the United States for so many years. But I thought that was kind of part of a deal with a partner that we trusted. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should have really neglected our security, but I would say that we are dealing right now with a very significant change that is really pushing the EU to get its own defense into its own hands. And what this means going forward for EU-Taiwan relations, I think one thing we share is that Taiwan is facing the exact same pressure, I mean, in its own way, but no one is spared of that, because you would think that Washington might put pressure on its competitors and rivals, not on its most trusted partners, such as Canada, the United States. Taiwan has responded in a way but of course, for Taiwan, the US remains its most significant security partner, and Taiwan has to really be very mindful of how it goes forward. But what this means for EU-Taiwan relations, I think it's still a question I'm not able perhaps to just speculate on. But what I see is that if we lose trust in the United States, I think there is a temptation to look more at China. And if we look more at China, that there might be a consequence to how much we do with Taiwan. So everything is linked, of course. But I don't think that that's as easy as said. So it's, I think there is a strong interest in Beijing to make sure that they keep Europe close, and the charm offensive is on. But I think by now, with Hong Kong and COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's strong support to that, I think we have a different idea of what it means to work with China. So everything is possible, I think, everything under Trump 2.0. But I really do feel that for Europe, keeping itself relevant in the Indo-Pacific is not going to be lower on its agenda.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. And perhaps time really does fly, and we have roughly 5 minutes left. I will try to pick some from the audience. And this builds on your previous answer. So with the EU having to rapidly rearm in response to the US and NATO, can you picture the European countries increasing their strategic presence in the Indo-Pacific in a more long-term horizon? This is a question from our intern, Viktor Simov.
Thank you for the question, Victor. So if European countries will increase their strategic presence in the Indo-Pacific, so I used the example of Germany, and I suspect that this is not going to stop, that countries in Europe, those with the capacity, will continue to make themselves present and relevant. But again, it's a question of capacity. There is no EU level security capacity in that sense. The challenge will be, first of all, internally within the EU, to restructure our defense, to coordinate procurement, and also to decrease the fragmentation in the 27 defense industries. So the focus will be to really strengthen that internally. And I think what stays at the core of the EU's geopolitical positioning of any sort is partnership with like-minded partners. And that's clearly not what we can say about Washington. Perhaps we could say that under Biden, but under Trump, that's clearly not the case. But for Europe, there is continuity in that between the two commissions. The Ursula von der Leyen continues to be the president. She's had a hawkish stance on China, and she's been very clear on de-risking, but engaging difficult partners such as China. So I suspect that we will continue on that front. But I think what I cannot speak to is what China will do, because I think a lot depends on how China behaves. So we have been responding to Chinese pressure, China increasing gray zone activities on the region, bullying the entire ASEAN, and also East Asia. So I think the response to that will be also in line with how far China goes. So we'll have to see.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsa. And you mentioned the like-minded partners there, and I'm prompted to ask another question from the audience that deals with human rights. How can Taiwan and the EU cooperate on the promotion of their shared perception on human rights in venues that go beyond traditional international fora? It's from an anonymous attendee.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. So in terms of human rights, democracy, rule of law, these are interconnected fundamental values that the EU's narrative is based on. And I think, of course, you may question to what extent this has been something that we've managed to really pursue in reality, but the narrative hasn't changed, and it's been also at the core of EU-Taiwan cooperation, and the two sides have been holding regular human rights dialogues and engaging with civil society. And so how can Taiwan and the EU cooperate in venues that go beyond traditional international fora? So I think, again, parliamentary diplomacy is one way to cover these issues. And I mean, the question is right in suggesting that both sides need to be creative because of the lack of diplomatic relations. But again, that said, that doesn't mean that the two sides cannot deepen their cooperation. So internationally, there are different exchanges and conversations that happen on human rights and fundamental values. And I think we see both sides participate and engage. So I believe that this is and remains the core.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsa. And I noticed that is all the time that we have for today. I hoped we could get to more questions, but we just had too much to talk about. So I would like to kindly thank you, Zsuzsa, for presenting today and engaging with me and our audience, answering all of our questions. And I would like to thank everyone in the audience tuning in for asking terrific questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for having me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, and see you next time.
See you. Bye-bye.